1916 was Mount Holly Springs' first centennial. Now, some of you are probably wondering, well, that's not right. There was a centennial in 1973, and there was then too. But 1916 was to celebrate the 100 years from the 1816 laying out housing lots that my brother explained. And so in 1916, 100 years, it's time to party, and so Mount Holly Springs did that. Notice that there was an historical pageant. Now, our mother was an English teacher, and she'd be rolling as far as how they spell pageant here. Not sure what that was with the historical pageant, but there were all kinds of festivities going on in 1916, including a parade. Started at the Chestnut Street School, went all through town, up Chestnut Street, down Pine Street to the square, up past the Holly Inn, U-turn, back to the square, down East Pine Street, U-turn, back to the square, down Baltimore Avenue, and then Chestnut Street back to the school. And so there was definitely a band that played. There were speakers that spoke. I'm not sure what the historical pageant was all about, but that theme is going to come up again as we go through this. One of the houses the parade went by is already been mentioned, the Sylvanus Mayberry house. Pam Still, she's here. Raise your hand, Pam. She lives in that house. This is a modern day view of that house. It's taken facing north. And that was built, as my brother mentioned, in 1794. It is on the Cumberland County Historical Society County Register of Historic Places, and it was the Iron Master's mansion. There are all kinds of interesting people that have lived in that house. I'm going to talk about some of them, and we'll go from there. So let's move to the 1973 celebration. That's a centennial too, because that's celebrating the 1873 incorporation of Mount Holly Springs as a borough. How many ever attended the centennial celebration? Anybody in here at that event? There are a few folks that were there. Well, it was quite the event. It was a week-long festival, a party of things going on in Mount Holly, and that included an historical pageant. It included a street fair, an antique show and flea market, a library open house, a parade, chicken barbecue, drum and bugle corps performance, a beer contest, princess contest, and fireworks. I was 15 at that point, and the town was buzzing. Everybody was out and about for the centennial celebration. Here's some pictures. This is a picture of the centennial headquarters. The person that's holding the balloons is Tex Stoisinger's daughter, Debbie, and I think she's still living. I'm not sure what her last name is, but she was selling balloons. That building is no longer standing. There was a big parade. Notice that it was a rainy day, and look how many people are lining the streets here. You probably see Arnold's Food Market, a landmark store that was in Mount Holly, no longer there. It's now the Family Dollar store, and Klein's Pharmacy is pictured there as well. And there was an historical picture book that was established in 1973, written by Winnie Trossel, and it was used in a lot of projects since then as far as getting history information. It was also used definitely in the historical pageant that was done in 1973. And then that takes us to this year, and this year is our sesquicentennial celebration. What you see on the screen is the cover of the booklet that's been established and is available for distribution. In fact, there are order forms in the back if you're interested in pre-ordering a copy. And so that's the sesquicentennial. It's an 80-page book that includes captions and pictures of then and now. Very interestingly done. There was a committee that worked on that. It was really a collaboration between the Mount Holly Springs Borough, Cumberland County Historical Society, Mount Holly Springs Heart and Soul. There were 4 of us on that committee. Matthew March was part of that committee from the Historical Society. Heart and Soul was represented by myself and Pam Still. Brian Robertson, whose vision it was to do this project, he's the one that thought of doing this again to recreate and make better potentially the 1973 book. The mayor is here. Brian, you want to wave your hand? This was his project, and he reached out to everybody to be part of that. And so that's happening as we speak. Another event that's happening on Saturday is a theatrical pageant. Remember, we talked about these plays keep resurfacing in celebrations. It's Holly Heroines, Stories Seldom Told. And it's scheduled for the Mount Holly Springs Church of God on Saturday, April 15th at 7 p.m. Unfortunately, it's sold out. But we are going to record that performance, and we'll make that available online for folks who can't attend because there are no tickets. The interesting part about this play, it features 10 prominent, remarkable women in Mount Holly Springs, starting in the 1700s and making our way through present times. And so that's another activity that's happening for the sesquicentennial. But if we're going to talk about the remarkable women of Mount Holly Springs, we really need to start with the one that got it all started, and that's Amelia Gibbon. And this picture is in the library. It's a portrait of Amelia Gibbon at the library. There was a Gardner Library article recently put on the Historical Society Facebook page. The story is pretty well known, but Amelia Gibbon had her father and 4 brothers and an uncle who everybody expected one of them to take the mill on as far as running the mill when the father passed. But unfortunately, they all died. And Amelia was left and her mother was left. And the father died in 1879. The mother died in 1887. And Miss Gibbon inherited the family fortune. The library was built in 1889, dedicated in 1890. In a 1990 Sentinel article, which was celebrating the library centennial, Cindy Stratton Thompson, the current head of the Gibbon Library, stated that Amelia Gibbon was ahead of her time in wanting education and information available to no matter how much money you had or your status in life. And so I'm going to read from the Gramley book a pretty interesting description of Amelia Gibbon from someone who evidently knew her or may have been her biographer. So let me share that. Now, the Gramley book was published in 1944. It was called The Introduction to Mount Holly Springs, Pennsylvania. And there was a person whose name was, get ready for this, Birtle, Fraley, McDonald, McPherson. And she was quoted in the Gramley book when she wrote the story of Miss Gibbon's life in 1939. So obviously she was alive when Miss Gibbon was alive. She died in 1915. Here's what she had to say. I would say that Miss Amelia was born at a time when the mental and physical powers of her parents, Robert and Virginia, were at their heights. Perhaps this would account for some of her unusual attributes. From her mother, she inherited her beauty of face and form, her charm of manner, and her vivid personality. From her father came her brilliant mind, her strong sense of right and wrong, and her exceptional business ability. These are the things that make her such an unusual woman for her day and age. She goes on to say, in 1879, Colonel Gibbon died, and Miss Amelia and her mother were left alone. On the daughter descended her father's business responsibility, and she showed herself to be a capable businesswoman. This trait was very unusual when one considers that in that day and age, women preferred to be the clinging vine type who screamed at the sight of a mouse. Let the man tend to the business because the woman considered that she could never understand it. With this attitude, it is only natural that the men were a bit conceited. That's from Miss Burgess. And that's what she had to say. The thing about Mount Holly history is that there are all kinds of dates floating out there. No one's really sure exactly when things happened and exactly sure exactly what happened. But in the Randy Watts book on paper mills in Mount Holly Springs, he writes that in 1899, Miss Gibbon paid for the construction of what is now known as the Amelia Gibbon Library in Mount Holly Springs. It has been said that Amelia Gibbon became involved in the management of the Mount Holly Paper Company after the death of Samuel, that was the uncle, that was Robert's brother, in 1892, although this has not been confirmed by this writer. Amelia married Walter Beale in 1892, just months after her uncle Samuel died. She was noted for her travel and philanthropy, but no contemporary documents involve her in the management of the paper company until 1906, when she petitioned the court to have the company placed in a reorganization. So we know she was involved. To what extent and for how long, we're not sure. So one of the things that I'm passionate about is to make history relevant for those who live today, and particularly those young people who live today. And so we decided to get involved in a collaborative. There were some interested folks in Mount Holly that were mostly retired, in addition to the Gibbon Library, the Carlisle Area School District, and the Cumberland County Historical Society. And we wanted to feature Miss Gibbon for the elementary school kids because she's the most well-known Mount Holly person in history. And so in the spring and summer of 2020, there were all kinds of events happening at the school. Now the good news about the school is that the principal at the time, and still the principal, was a Holly girl. So it didn't take a lot of convincing to get her involved in doing these things with the school. And so this is a picture of a parent night, and we attended several of these at the elementary school in 2020. Paula Broussard is the person in the middle. She dressed up as Amelia Gibbon. Was the school board president then, and still continues as the school board president. And she roamed the halls during the event. Also in that picture is Deborah Sweeney, who at that time was also on the Carlisle Area School Board, and she volunteered at the school, and she's also an author. She writes books, and that's the picture of her, and then there are two students. And we formed what we called the Mount Holly Springs History Collaborative in 2020. The goal was to make the Mount Holly Springs elementary students develop more of a sense of place by learning about Mount Holly Springs history. And the thing is, people living in small towns celebrate that neighbors know neighbors and that people who live in small towns matter. And we wanted to give the kids a sense of that by connecting them to the history of their community. This was another parent night. This is one of my favorite pictures. This was another event. This was an event where Matthew March had a table at a parent night, and he was showing the kids colonial games or games of yesteryear. And so I was in charge of doing jacks, which was really interesting. And Carmen James, who's in this picture, she decided she was going to do bowling. Well, she met this young guy bowling, and they had such fun. We were supposed to switch games. The kids were supposed to do some experience of one games and go to another. Well, these two bowled the whole night, and they had a great time. And it was such a great picture to see Carmen connecting with the young person in an historical context, which is really the whole point. And so then what we did is throughout the spring, the teachers worked with the kids, and the History Collaborative provided information. I did a faculty meeting with the teachers. We did the tour with the teachers. We gave them materials, and they worked on projects with the kids throughout the spring. And that culminated in an event for Summer Fair in July of 2020. And the kids presented their projects, and there was ice cream, there was a music performance, and walking tours. It's really, really quite an event. Another activity that happened back then was something Matthew March coordinated, and this is really, I just rediscovered this, I had forgotten about this. This was really a cool activity. So what happened with this is we were trying to make sure we wanted to connect to the curriculum of the Carlisle Area School District for the different grade levels. Now in the past, part of that curriculum is a walking history tour, a walking field trip, and typically the Mount Holly kids were bused from Holly to Carlisle to walk through Holly. So one of our goals was, well, why do they have to go to Carlisle to learn about local history? There's plenty of history right here in Mount Holly. And because Molly Davis was the Holly girl, we didn't take a lot of convincing, and we were able to turn that around for the Holly kids, where they did a tour of Mount Holly. But also what happened with this project is the kids, with the help of their teachers, developed questions based on their social studies curriculum, but also connected to Mount Holly Springs. And so they would ask questions, and then Matthew would answer. And it was amazing. This is something that you can get to. I think Sean Gladden has the link that I sent to him for this, or you can Google it, you'll find it. it's really interesting to hear the questions the kids ask, because they put a lot of time and thought into the questions, and then Matthew answered. And so that's still available as a resource for the school. This is a picture at the library for that celebration. Miss Davis is pictured on this, and some kids, and then Paula Broussard is there. Another project that we did is we put together a slide deck, and the slide deck would include pictures and text about Mount Holly history, and then we came up with writing prompts. So you can see the picture, then it explains the picture, but the writing prompt for this one is, if that park and trolley were still here today, who would you ride that trolley with to go to Mount Holly Springs Park, and what would you do? So again, we're trying to connect the history with the kids of today. Kids like to have fun, they like to go to parks, they like to do things, and that was part of the plan with this slide deck. Here's one of my favorites. This is another flood picture. Now this is the subway. I'm not sure if the car was going toward Holly or going toward Carlisle, but that person, the kid in the picture, that's Erwin Gitt, and he's on a bicycle. And he's having a grand time riding in that flooded subway. So the writing prompt is, think about your choices. What have you done that probably wasn't as safe to say? What would you do differently? And this is another favorite. This is an iconic picture. Everybody that sees this picture thinks, oh, that's my brother, that's my uncle, that's my family. It's featured in that picture. And so we give some background to the picture. It actually is a train coming from Gettysburg with a steam engine, which was, I think was an apple blossom excursion. And of course, when the steam engine came through Holly, you knew it was coming by the whistle, and everybody went down to what was the Pine Street train station. That no longer exists. And I can remember when our dad took us down there, we would put pennies on the track well before the train came, and then, of course, the train went over the pennies, and that was our little souvenir. But guess who this guy is? The guy in this picture, we verified this. That's Randy Watts. That's Randy Watts in that picture. The car and the people around the car those are his family members. And so that just illustrates the whole point. Randy Watts is big time into history. He's a well-known, respected local historian. Well, his interest in history started when he was a kid. And so when we do these things with the school and with young people, we're hoping we're going to, create the next Randy Watts to do the next generation. So the Mount Holly History Collaborative kind of morphed into what is now the Mount Holly Springs Heart and Soul. And the Heart and Soul process is really, it's a nationwide effort. It's really to find out what matters most to those who live, learn, work, or play in a community, and also to find out what are the hopes and dreams of those people. And data is collected, information is collected, then what we do is look at trends for information, and then we try to come up with putting the small town's values in words, and we're going to get to that in a second. But let's take a look at this logo. This logo was developed by a local artist. This logo was developed by Holly Coick Cameron. And Holly has her own art business and her own graphic design business. And we love this. You do notice, don't you, that the in between the holly leaves, do you notice what's there? There's a heart there. And so that's our logo. And so that's something she designed. So Mount Holly Springs Heart and Soul, well, we decided we wanted to keep going with the Remarkable Women thing. But then the pandemic hit, so we had to go virtual. But we had plenty of sources, plenty of material to feature as far as Remarkable Women. One of those women was Alice Mackenzie Swain. And Alice Mackenzie Swain happened to live in the Sylvanus Mayberry house, Pam's house, in the 40s. And she was the wife of a Presbyterian minister, William Swain. He was a pastor at the Newville Presbyterian Church, and he was a pastor at the Monaghan Presbyterian Church in Dillsburg. But he also was in on the ground floor of developing Presbyterian Homes, which is now Presbyterian Senior Living, which is a East Coast presence now as far as senior living. Well, Alice Swain became bedridden at a pretty young age. She had 2 young kids. but she really couldn't do much. She was an invalid. And she turned to poetry to stimulate her mind. Her poetry journey started in Mount Holly Springs, and it continued when the family moved to Dillsburg. She published over 900 poems, probably into the thousands, and received international recognition for her work. And one of the projects that we did is we developed what we call a story map. And a story map combines pictures, text, audio files, and video files in a document that you can experience and find out all kinds of information about someone. This is available for folks to look at now, and it was called The Remarkable Woman from Mount Holly Springs, featuring Alice Mackenzie Swain. And here's one of Alice's early poems about beautiful Mount Holly. I'm not going to read this to you. I'll give you a second to read it to yourself. But as you're reading, think about what Fred talked about for when tourism took hold of Mount Holly. Why did people come? Well, they came for the mountain air. They came for the surrounding mountains. They came because of Mountain Creek. And that's exactly what Mrs. Swain was writing about in this poem. Well, if you're going to be a tourist town, you better be welcoming. And so she also wrote about the people in Mount Holly Springs in this early poem. And I'll let you take a look at that for a second. So we decided we wanted to do an event. We wanted to do a poetry event. Well, we were hoping to do a poetry tea at the library, but we couldn't because the library was shut down for the pandemic. So we did we did a Zoom event. Now, it was a memorable event. I'm not going to tell you why now. We could talk later. But we did do a Zoom event, and we featured a book that was written about Alice Swain's poetry. It's this book is one that I have here. It's called A Poet for the Ages, and it features a lot of the poetry that Alice Swain wrote. And it was like what we ended up doing was a poetry reading, and we had different folks reading her different poems, and also gave some background of Alice Swain from the story map. But it's interesting, in this book, here's what Alice Swain writes. And again, she was bedridden, but she found something that became her passion. And she, was resilient and overcame adversity here. And then she writes, "The hardest thing in the world for me to understand is boredom. My universe has always been too stimulating, too many sights and sounds and smells, too much to touch and taste and feel, too much to remember, and at times the last too much to forget." Just powerful stuff. So Mrs. Swain, interestingly enough, she had 2 daughters. One is still living. Kathy Swain lives in Massachusetts. We communicate on a pretty regular basis. I mailed her a sesquicentennial book and got a wonderful note back from her today. So we keep in touch with the efforts here in Mount Holly Springs to remember her mother as a remarkable woman. Well, who else was there? Well, there was Miss Noggle, and she was a beloved kindergarten teacher in Mount Holly Springs. She taught at Mount Holly Springs Elementary School. She started her teaching at the Chestnut Street School in 1956. She died in 2020, in August of 2020. Again, the pandemic, we just did a workaround. We did a Zoom tribute for Miss Noggle. And this is a picture of Miss Noggle in her older years. But that tribute included interviews that were recorded by past principals, past students, parents who worked with her as aides in her classroom. It included community members. She was absolutely beloved. And I had a friend that wrote poetry. And I told her all these things about Miss Noggle, and I said, well, I need something. That was maybe Tuesday. I said, I need you to write me a poem. I need it by Saturday. And I told her about Miss Noggle, all of her attributes, and here's what she came up with. My friend's name is Tanya Zuber. It says, "Miss Betty Jo Noggle was one of a kind, teaching generations of children, leaving no child behind. How do you say goodbye to a beautiful soul who taught every child what they needed to know? Their journey began with her fierce dedication, providing them all with the best education. Her encouragement and guidance helped children to grow, putting smiles on their faces with her morning hello. She helped encourage, inspire, and mold little children's futures with her heart of gold. Now those little smiles and the seeds she has sown are all grown up now with children of their own. To say farewell can be so very sad, but cherish the moments with her you once had. Those memories remembered will now mean so much because she will live on in each heart she has touched. And so, Miss Noggle, another remarkable woman in Mount Holly Springs. Well, are there more? Well, of course there are. Let's talk about Harriet Gumby. And let's talk about the Mount Tabor Preservation Project. This is a picture of Harriet Gumby in 2017 at the unveiling of the Cumberland County Register of Historic Places plaque. Now realize that the story of Harriet Gumby and the story of Mount Tabor was a mystery to a lot of folks, not to all. I mean, my brother and I knew about the Cedar Streets Church. We knew the Gumbys, but many people had no idea because the story of this church was their congregation was dwindling, and in 1970 they had very few attending the church, so they had a service, they closed the door, left all the furnishings inside the church, and that was the end of that church being an active church. And so many didn't know about that church. So with the efforts of the Cumberland County Historical Society and the Revitalization Committee in Mount Holly, with Pam still leading the charge on that, she did a series of recording stories that people from Mount Holly Springs would be interviewed so that we could record those and have those at the part of the Gardner Library. Again, we want to connect the past and make it relevant to the present to shape the future. This picture shows some historic designations for the Mount Tabor Church. And obviously the cemetery has been restored. Again, this story is pretty well known. Elias Parker was Harriet Gumby's grandfather. He was responsible for building the church. He was also a Civil War veteran. There were Civil War veterans buried in the Mount Tabor Cemetery, and those gravestones have been restored. All kinds of work has been done at the Mount Tabor Church. And Harriet Gumby wanted people to remember her grandfather. Now, Amelia Gibbon wanted a legacy. What's her legacy? Well, her legacy was the library. Harriet Gumby wanted to leave a legacy, and her legacy was the Mount Tabor Church, the story about her grandfather in the Mount Tabor Cemetery. So this legacy thing keeps resurfacing. I'll get to the point of a remarkable woman in a minute, but let's take a look about Harriet's brother, William Gumby. Now you can see from the text in this picture that he was pretty accomplished. He was a really good student. And he went to the Chestnut Street School through 6th grade, and then he went to the Lamberton High School, which I think at that point was 7 through 12. And he was a really good student. He went on to go to Dickinson College and graduated from Dickinson College with a degree in chemistry. And then a few years later, he went to Penn State for his master's, and he got his master's degree at Penn State, and then got a job with Bausch & Lomb in Rochester, New York, and he was on the ground floor of the development of contact lenses. Mount Holly Springs, William Gumby. Well, there has to be some bridges built here, because the Gumby family, they were rich in love, they were rich in hard work, they were rich in treating people the right way, and they were rich in their faith, but they didn't have any money. And so that was problematic for William Gumby to go to college, until another remarkable woman took charge of the situation, and that was Miss Trine. Anybody ever hear of Miss Trine before, or have her in school maybe, potentially? Well, Miss Trine also grew up in Mount Holly. She was, and you can see what her credentials are, but her beginnings are very humble. She was the only child of John and Lily Trine. She owned a dairy farm that included the land that now houses the Mount Holly Springs Borough Building, the Mount Holly Springs Elementary School, Trine Avenue townhouses, Moreland Avenue and the properties along that, the Mount Holly Springs Methodist Church, Trine and Trine Park. Her lifespan overlapped the lifespan of Amelia Gibbon. So you have a farm girl who was passionate and pursued degrees in classic literature. Well, how did that happen? Well, we only can conjecture that she probably ended up at the Gibbon Library for more than just a little bit, and that potentially ignited that passion. So at any rate, she was an English teacher when William Gumby was at Carlisle High School. And she had connections to Dickinson College. And the group of people that she was working with had mentioned that if you ever find any colored person of promise, let us know. And Miss Trine thought of William Gumby, connected William Gumby to a scholarship, which led the way for William Gumby to consider going to college, but there was just another problem. The Gumbys didn't have a car. And he said, there's no way I can get to Carlisle. No worries. Fred mentioned where the Trines lived. They lived at the Square. If you're familiar with Mount Holly, you know where the Gumby house is or where Mount Tabor is. It's on Mountain Street. Well, William just had to walk from the Gumby house to the Square, hitch a ride with Miss Trine to go to Carlisle High School, walk to Dickinson campus, do his classes, do his thing, and wait for Miss Trine when she was done with her teaching day, and then they drove back to Mount Holly. That's how he got to school. Without Miss Trine, William Gumby wouldn't have gone to college. And what William Gumby did for the black community on Mountain Street was to set the standard that it is possible to go to college. And that was followed by other Gumby siblings going to college, and others on Mountain Street going to college or post-high school education. And it all started as the domino effect started with Miss Trine. So we also have a story map about Miss Trine that's available for more detailed information. But getting back to Mount Tabor Church, here's a picture of Larry Foster and Carmen James. Remember, we talked about the furnishings were still in the church. And they had taken the pews out, and Larry and Carmen are reminiscing about the services that they attended at the church. Now realize that services at the Mount Tabor Church were at least 3 hours long every Sunday. There were no pads on those pews, and the kids were expected to stay for that entire time with the adults. So obviously people got a little antsy and moved around a bit and were not particularly attentive. But here's a picture of what was inside the church before it shut down. You'll notice that there's a portrait of Jesus behind the pulpit. And that picture of Jesus, what Larry and Carmen talk about, is no matter where they moved in that church, if they switched pews, Jesus was watching. That's how they felt that. I mean, they were that was the speed bump on behavior back then. And so, like we mentioned, the doors closed, everything was left in the church. Pam climbs in the window, opens the front door. A lot of the stuff's still there, but not the portrait of Jesus. It's gone. Now, we talked about the field trip opportunity that we had for the Holly kids to do a walk around or even bus around Mount Holly, because you'd have to take a bus to get to Mount Tabor from where the school is. And they had done that trip earlier, and we had, through Miss Davis, we scheduled the first, that I know, a Black History Month assembly at Mount Holly School. And Carmen explained about the work at Mount Tabor Cemetery, told the Mount Tabor story, and mentioned about all the things that they had done in the field trip. And then there was time for questions. And so I can't remember, I think it was a 4th grader, raised his hand, and he said, "Have you found Jesus yet?" That was pretty impressive that he remembered about that portrait months before. Well, I'm happy to report tonight that there's a community effort to raise money to contract with a black artist to paint or draw a portrait of Jesus tending to the eyes. He said, you gotta do the eyes right for this portrait. And that's hopefully going to be unveiled in June, this coming June, at an event during one of the Mount Tabor tours. And so we've got some remarkable women, and these are just some of them. So we have the feature with Miss Given, and she's the first one on her. Beside in the middle there, you have Miss Trine, and then you have Mrs. Swain, and then we have standees for those 3 that we take to different events. We don't have a standee for Harriet Gumby yet, but we superimposed her picture with these standees because that's in the works. We're going to be getting that. And so the remarkable women, some of the remarkable women of Mount Holly. If the Holly Heroines event is going to talk about even more remarkable women from before this time. And I'm not going to do any spoilers on what's in there. Again, if you can't attend, you can at least get the video clip. So I'm a former educator. I retired as a teacher and a principal, so we got to talk about education. And this is a picture of the Chestnut Street School in Mount Holly Springs. And let me read some information about this. The original Mount Holly Springs School, located on Chestnut Street, housed grades 1 through 9. It was built about 1875 and was composed of 2 buildings, one facing north and the other south. Oh, wait a second, there are not 2 buildings there. Well, that's because the middle part was added later. It was built around 1900 and it joined the 2 original schools into what was called a 6-room building. And here's a picture of Miss Noggle with her 1957 kindergarten students outside the Chestnut Street School. And here's a picture of a classroom in the Chestnut Street School. I'm guessing probably 3rd or 4th grade is what looks like to be those students, and that's what their classroom looked like. And then I got something from Charles Gitt, who now lives in Dillsburg, but he grew up in Mount Holly Springs. He said, my mother gave me this poem, or had this poem, or this song, actually, the lyrics to a song, and it was the Mount Holly school song. And Charles Gitt shared that it was written by a 4th grade teacher. I'm not sure if he said it was in the 40s or the 50s. I'm thinking maybe, well, it could be either. I'm not sure when. And he mentioned that that song was sung every morning as part of the opening school routine at the school. So you can't see the lyrics, so let me share these with you. Near a flowing stream in a valley green stands a school of great renown. 'Tis the school we love, and it's far above any school of any town. If we're far or near, she'll be always dear to the memories of the past, and where we go, if it's high or low, we'll be loyal to the last. The chorus is Hail, Hail, Mount Holly. We shout her praises true. Work for Mount Holly, for the world will have work for you. Win for Mount Holly the fame that she is due, and show the world, each boy and girl, of Mount Holly School. So that was a song they would sing. And so that was a tight-knit school. Mount Holly Springs is a tight-knit community. I like to think of it as a welcoming community. If you're going to be a tourist town, you better be welcoming, or you're not going to get people to come. So that was a long-standing, history, legacy. And so here's a picture of some beauties that met in 1st grade at the Mount Holly Chestnut Street School. And they were classmates through their experience at the Chestnut Street School, through Carlisle High School, and they were best buds, and they still are. These folks they met before the pandemic, they met regularly for lunch or breakfast, and they're getting back to doing that now. And it just goes to show you the types of relationships that form when you have a tight-knit school. And I wanted to share that. But alas, the Chestnut Street School was not going to meet the mustard as far as the needs of a school as the 50s came around. So they needed to do something. And this is a picture of the groundbreaking of the Butler Street School in 1954. Not sure who those kids are. We think one of the kids might be from the Chestnut family in Mount Holly. We're not sure. And let me give you some background on what was going on. In September of 1955, all junior high school pupils, that would be all 7th and 8th grade kids from Mount Holly, were transported to the Lamberton building in Carlisle. And the Chestnut Street School was then, at that point in 1955, was designated to house 4th, 5th, and 6th grades. The new building was designed so that more classrooms, I'm talking about that's another, sorry, I read too much. And so what had to happen is they needed a new elementary school. So they built the elementary school on Butler Street. Here was the first rendition. This was in 1955. And so what happened with this school, it was designed so that more classrooms could be added if the old building, the Chestnut Street School, ever closed, or if there was increased enrollments required. Well, we know that the increased enrollments were coming. It was the post-war boom. And so The school was built in 1955, and for the next 4 years, both the original school building on Chestnut Street and the Butler Street School were used to house the elementary pupils of Mount Holly Springs, Pennsylvania. Now, different years resulted in different places because it's all based on enrollment. So sometimes the grades could be at the Chestnut Street School, but then they might be at the Butler Street School. It all depended. They were kind of scrambling to find enough room for all these kids. But on January 20th in 1959, the Pennsylvania Department of Labor and Industry declared the Chestnut Street building to be unsafe for use as an elementary school unless there were improvements. Rather than change the original building, the Mount Holly Springs School Board, which we had their own school board then, voted to proceed with the construction of an addition to the new Butler Street building. And this is what that looked like. So that's the 1962 version of the elementary school. And there's Miss Noggle again, teaching kindergarten in the new school. That's what her thing. Now, that was in 1962. I was in that classroom the next year in 1963. So again, the school wasn't big enough. More kids than we had space. So that led to another addition in 1989. And guess who did the groundbreaking? There's Miss Noggle again doing the groundbreaking. And the picture you see in the next slide is what the school looks like today. That's the present iteration of Mount Holly Springs Elementary School. And so that's the education part. I didn't talk anything about sports, but I can't not talk about a person in Mount Holly Springs who's famous for his baseball abilities. We all know who that is.
Jesse Stoll.
Jesse Stoll paved the way. Without Jesse Stoll, there wouldn't be the person I'm talking about. Because Sid's father played for Jesse Stoll and others. But this is Sid Brame. He grew up in Mount Holly from a wonderful family. He had lots of siblings. He had several sisters, two sisters and 2 brothers, I think it is. He played Major League Baseball. He played for the Dodgers from 83 to 85, the Pirates from 85 to 90, and then the Atlanta Braves from 1991 to 1993, and then he ended his career with the Houston Astros. He was involved in a pretty interesting game, and let's see what happened with that game. That was quite a memorable game. That's called The Slide. It's all over YouTube. You can get to that. But that's Sid Brame. Here's an interesting thing. Sid Brame was probably the most famous athlete from Mount Holly. But Buzz Wolf, I don't know if anybody knows that person, he put a Facebook post and he did a poll. He wanted to find out from people who they thought were the most accomplished athletes from Mount Holly Springs. And so all these folks weighed in, and several names were mentioned. Sid was mentioned repeatedly. But Sheldon Brame posted, and Sheldon was Sid's brother, and Sheldon was quite an athlete too. He was the sixth man on the Carlisle High School championship games in the 80s with Billy Owens and Jeff Levo. Very important player there. Here's what Sheldon had to say. Sheldon said, Sid is the most famous athlete from Mount Holly, but Teresa Brame is the best athlete to ever come out of Mount Holly Springs, in my humble opinion. I'm pretty sure Sid would agree with me. So that's an interesting take on the Brame family, or the Brame family. And so that brings us to the end of our presentation. We have some folks to thank. None of this effort, going back to the revitalization effort, going back to the beginnings of the Mount Tabor project, would have happened without Bob Murray. Bob Murray had all the pictures, all the artifacts organized, and was willing to share those things. We couldn't have done any of this stuff without him. Randy Watts certainly deserves a lot of credit as well with his writing of local history, including several Mount Holly books as we go forward with that. And I want to really give a shout out to the Cumberland County Historical Society. They've been partners with every step of the way with anything related to Mount Holly Springs history. And so we want to thank them as well. And you know, the point of this is this: history informs the present and shapes the future. So with the heart and soul effort, I'm hoping that you might take a look at some documents that are in the back of the room. You know, we talked to all these people, and one of the things Bob Murray told me at one point, he said, is one of my biggest worry is we're going to lose our small town values. Well, what are the small town values? And so one of the projects we're working on through Heart and Soul is to define, put words to paper about what those values are. And we have several categories. And I'm not going to read all of this to you, but here are the categories. History is important, it's a value for Mount Holly Springs. Being a welcoming community. And these things go back decades. From all the stuff you've heard tonight, you're hearing these same things over and over again. Education, which would include the Given Library and the school districts and other organizations. Safety, the environment, which would include the mountains, the creek, the Holly Gap, the parks. Mount Holly has done a marvelous job in rejuvenating community parks. It's amazing the things that are happening there. Municipal government, to be a responsive municipal government, and economics, where people can afford to live there, where people can afford to own a home rather than rent a home, where people can afford childcare. These are the values that we've come up with in getting feedback from people. There's a really 3-point survey back there in the back. If you would be gracious enough to weigh in, we'd love to add your information to what we've already collected. And so that is the end of our presentation. Any questions from anybody?
I just have a concern.
Okay.
The church that was burnt in 1973, 1970, the church that was, it seems that there seems to be a homeowner that's building a really big garage in front of the cemetery.
Yeah.
It makes me feel sad because no one's going to be to see the cemetery because that big building's going to be blocking it.
Well, that building's been noticed, and that is unfortunate, but there's not much that can be done with that.
I just hope it doesn't get trashed.
Yeah, I know. I can feel. I know exactly where you're talking.
Yeah, it seems sad to see that.
Anything else? Yes.
I was going to South Dixon School around that time, and they were, I guess, building on to the Holly School.
Right.
Neighbors busing children over to our school and going through school with us.
Right.
For about a year or two.
Yeah. I think Miss Noggle taught at North Dickinson, or South Dickinson for a year, I think. So. All right, well then I'm going to turn things back over. Oh, another question? Go ahead.
I don't have a question, I just was wondering if anybody has any stories of Mount Holly Springs.
Oh, okay. That's
I first entered Mount Holly Springs 80 years ago, so I've been around to watch a lot of things happen in Mount Holly. And several things that you mentioned there came back, and of course Sid Ring, Sheldon, which is his brother, made the remark.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell you what, I don't think Sid would dispute that.
Yeah. Yeah.
She was extremely good.
Yeah.
Let's see. I wanted to say, I saw that park up there, that everybody went to the Holly Park. Well, that's not the park I grew up with. The park I grew up in, Mount Holly, was just north of the railroad subway going toward Carlisle. It was on the right.
Hartzell Park.
What was it called?
Hartzell Park?
Might have been called Hartzell Park, but that's the one I grew up with when I was a kid. And they brought entertainment in there from the Grand Ole Opry. And that's where I saw some of my bigger stars when I went down. That was the place to go, and you could go for free. And the other thing was, you didn't mention that Newville, or Mount Holly, I come out of Newville too. Mount Holly had a theater. And that was the big event because I grew up about 6 miles outside of Mount Holly. And if we got a chance to go to Mount Holly, which my parents would take us down there, 4 boys, maybe every Saturday night. Eventually got almost every Saturday night because we could go to the movie theater in Mount Holly. And probably the total price for all of those all 6 of us was probably not 75 cents. So we went to the movie every Saturday night in Mount Holly. And we went to the park when entertainers would come in, we went to the Mount Holly Park. But the big thing we went to all summer was Mount Holly baseball. Jesse Stahl had a team which was very competitive, and it was in the Cumberland County League. And that was only what you had to put into the hat when they passed it around. So therefore, we had free entertainment just about, for maybe a quarter or 50 cents. And I was into Mount Holly. So but I first went in when I was about 80 years ago, when I first went into Mount Holly. And saw what it was like. The same street was down the middle, the secondary street up onto the right.
Chestnut Street.
Still there, and there was a lot of activity and houses built out around, but it's the same old Mount Holly. Yeah, it is.
Jim, I suggest we do an interview with him, maybe with the Gardner Library. He has a lot to talk about, a lot of
Yeah,
ideas.
that'd be great.
Yeah, it was.
Are there any other stories?
Where was the theater?
What's that?
Where was the theater?
I'm sorry.
Where, the theater, the movie house?
What was the theater?
4 doors down from the library.
There you are. Back there's a guy who knows more about Holly than I do. I just know the early years. But it was, and one of the big things is they had a little fair down there, a little street fair.
Still do.
That was exciting. Everybody would go to the street fair. God love them.
Matthew?
Oh,
Oh, go ahead.
I don't want to keep going, but the one thing you did mention that came to my mind, which gave me a little bit of a shiver, was when you said the word store singer.
Did you have a couple run-ins?
Mr. Tex Storsinger ran Mount Holly. And just about the time he was the chief of police, I was getting my driver's license. So, he had a good reputation, and he did keep me in line, I can tell you that. And the water system from Mount Holly came from the Cold Springs Road. Is that correct? Yeah. And that's where I only lived, about a mile from that water supply. So if I didn't like anybody from Holly, I'd go up there and throw a bunch of stones into their water. Go ahead, Mr.
Well, I just wanted to thank the gentleman very much